you get into these pylons, right, where you have an individual who might say one thing that was taken out of context, and then we know this is happening every 5 minutes, and there's these moral swarms that are sort of emerging, not based on a conscious process. It's almost never the case that all those people who are piling on actually know the details or were there or anything. But I think it's super important that, through what you're doing and through what we're trying to do with this podcast is like creating a different culture of immunity so that we don't, that cannot be the basis of our moral culture, because that thing does not stand. Instead of Abraham Lincoln, that a house divided cannot stand. Like a moral, swarm instincting system to create the basis of morality in a society, that thing definitely breaks. I mean, that is super dangerous, right?
I just wanted to say you hit on something that I think about a lot with cancel culture, and I know that that term means something different to so many people. So I call it shame culture, just so it's like destigmatized in people's minds. But I think that is I think about that with shame culture a lot, because when you get into the nitty gritty of all of these stories of shamings, right? The so-called canceled people, you actually find that usually the story is so complicated, right? You're like, oh, she said this thing. Sorry, wait, I'm curious, but can you just explain to me why that was offensive? Okay, now you've explained to me why that was offensive, and who did she offend with that? Okay, so she offended this person. And so there are so many layers to the story that it's like you just understandably are like, I do not have time for this. I cannot, like I don't want to get into this. So just tell me, is she racist? Is she transphobic? Okay, great, done. That's all I need to know. That's what I'm going to +1, because you are understandably not on the side of racism, not on the side of transphobia. And so I think it's like this really dangerous mix of our lack of time that we have, our lack of space to engage in a complicated story, and how many stories we're getting thrown at us all the time, that we just want to engage in the shorthand, and often the shorthand doesn't do justice to the nuances of the story. And so you just need those 2 words to know whether you want to cape for someone or not. So,
I
yeah.
think there's even another dynamic going on, which sort of preconditions all of us uh, towards sort of like this reactivity and seeing the worst or the simplest version of other people's stories. And, that is, we all walk around the world with some kind of trauma. And on social media, like whatever the worst thing you've ever clicked on becomes your world. So if you're like, Asian American and you're scrolling online and you see a video of somebody like harassing an Asian American, you're probably going to look at that, click on it, respond to it. And what does Twitter do? It shows you more of those things. And so you start to see like an infinite feed of examples of the thing that re-traumatizes you.
Yeah.
And that's not just true for like Asian Americans. This is for every different type of trauma.
Pro-police,
and of course now,
anti-police, pro-BLM, anti-BLM, pro-mask, whatever.
exactly. So this is like a kind of trauma inflation. It's like all of society is getting sort of inflamed because we're being shown the worst thing we've ever clicked on, unique to each one of us, that thing that'll activate. And then it's even worse because we're coming from 2 different realities. Like I have seen the thing that traumatizes me over and over again, but you haven't seen it because you've been clicking on other things. So when I start talking about it being, this is the worst thing, like this, I have an infinite amount of like first person experience showing me that this thing is happening. You're like, well, you're clearly an idiot because I've lived around the world and I'm getting this other thing. So I can't trust your reality. I can't trust your reality. And now we end up in this like increasingly schism-fractioned like global psychosis.
And that's also, in the left and the right? Like the right accuses the left of being oversensitive to homophobia, racism, or whatever. And the right, and then people who, if you've been inside of one of those, first of all, those things exist, and then the second is if you click on some of those things and you get this infinite reinforcement, you get this such a huge sort of overwhelming evidence of this thing that you know to be true, and you're also traumatized by it. So then when this person says that's not a real issue or you're overreacting because they haven't seen that in their feed or they just think that you're overreacting, it's like even more offensive that they would even question it. But similarly on the right, when you're like, oh, people on the right are never harassed by people on the left because you haven't seen those examples.
Yeah.
where there's people on the right. See infinite examples of people on the right who get harassed like violently by people on the left and flipping tables and BLM riots or whatever the thing is, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that it's so critical what Asa said. There's two pieces of that. The first is that trauma inflation. The second is the deflation of empathy. So we have one line that's going up where we are a tighter and tighter trigger. And the second is that we have less and less empathy or of a reality check that thing is even happening for that other person. And that's
Yeah.
why I think we haven't even appraised of this mass deluding trance that we have, this spell that we have all been under. And until we can name collectively and hold that and stabilize an awareness of that thing, that trauma inflation, empathy deflation, that has happened to all of us as one of many effects that we've been kind of highlighting on the show and broadly. I just think we can't get out of this. We need a immune system for these effects. Yeah, I'm just curious how you think about all these things.
I sound like I'm beating one single drum, but the best way I know how to do this is to bring people into conversation with each other. And again, this is one of those things that's funny. When I spoke at TED in 2018, the day after I spoke, someone was like, "How have you thought about how you're going to scale this up?" And it's like the most tech-based question, and there are of course fantasies, but the only way to scale this up is simply to have conversations and for more people to have conversations. And that doesn't mean that I like never stop producing episodes. That just means that like we need to create more of that. And I say that because it sounds like this incredibly simple thing, but Tristan, I completely agree with you that there is this dearth of empathy because we are all seeing different things and we don't see what someone else is seeing, and what is true for us is not necessarily true for someone else, and we feel offended when they negate our truth. And of course we do. When someone negates our truth, that's an offensive thing. When someone is saying what you experience isn't real, that hurts. When you bring people into conversation with each other, it's like a blossoming of empathy. And the empathy, this is not something you have to try for. This is not like, okay, put on your empathy hat and let's get into the nitty gritty. It's like it is a natural byproduct of conversation. So I think the more breakout rooms that we can create for people to connect with each other, um, in addition to all of the amazing tools that you guys are dreaming up and scheming and then actually implementing and asking people to implement, like it's not one or the other. It's like it's both. And I think more, you know, I think something I wanted to bring to you guys is like the tagline I say at the end of every episode is remember there's a human on the other side of the screen. And of course, the complicated thing is that goes both ways. That is, of course, for the person who's about to send the negative thing, the recipient of your negative message is a human. They have feelings. You're going to hurt those feelings. And complicatedly, the person who sent you that message is a human being, unless they're a bot. But of course, there's a caveat. But the person who sent that message is a human being who had a reason for sending that to you, even if that's not a particularly compelling reason or one that like you co-sign. That was a human being. What made that human being do that thing? And so the more ways we can, I'm not talking about my tagline, but the more ways we can infuse that idea into the public square, the more we can show not mirrors, but windows of humanity to each other, um, the better.
Technology is always putting choices on life's menu. The interface, the icons, the colors. There's a like button. There's a retweet button. There's a react button. You can choose an emotion or emoji you want to add to that message that the person sent. There's a kind of menu that is orchestrated by the technology and the screens that are put in front of us. And we're only as good as the choices that are on life's menu. And Dylan, in your work, what I hear you doing is saying, hey, there's a missing choice from this menu. And it's the, why did you write that response? The way that you, as I understand it, you reach out to people is you ask, why did you write me that message? Am I phrasing that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the most part, yeah.
Well, and essentially, and I also hear using the language of breakout rooms. There's no, hey, can I call you? Can I have a one-on-one conversation with you? That menu, that choice is not on life's menu as driven by the technology. You are adding that based on how you see the world and seeing there's a missing choice on life's menu. And in our work, what we're trying to do is get technologists to think about the way that they design not just the algorithms but the actual interfaces, to say what are the menus that would be most empowering for orchestrating and deepening the connections of the social fabric.